Hello, lovely listeners. Please enjoy this follow-up episode to Sid Bronca and I's discussion about the male gaze. This is like a part 2 to that episode where we talk about the female gaze. And if you're a little confused about why you're not getting male gaze part 2, remember that full episode is only available to patrons at patreon.com/girlsgutsgiallo or through Spotify subscriptions. I don't know if you want to give them your money. That's up to you. And this episode is the same. So the full version of this episode is only available to patrons or through Spotify subscriptions. And if you're listening on the free end here, you get the first hour and 20 minutes of this discussion. But the full discussion is 2.5 hours. So without further ado, please enjoy the free version of this episode.
You must tell me all your secrets. Remember, we must share everything together. Everything.
Si j'ai du talent, il est fort galant, mon corps insolent, le pauvre aisément, mon corps précieux et capricieux, l'azur de mes yeux. Audacieux.
Hello again, this is Annie Rose Malamet, and welcome back to another episode of Girls, Guts, and Giallo. And today, this is a bonus episode about, it's like a part 2 from our last bonus episode about the male gaze. And today we're talking about the female gaze. And I'm joined once again with Sid Bronca. Hi, Sid.
Hi, it's so nice to be here again.
So lovely to have you again. And Sid, can you remind the listeners who you are and what you do and like what you're about artistically?
Yeah, I will try to give a short answer to that. On the kind of academic side of things and educational side of things, I teach at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in film, video, new media, and animation. So I have a certain amount of like art historical context on that side, but also am making things and teaching people how to make things. So I'm a video artist and I make experimental moving image work in a variety of modes. And I'm particularly interested in things about gender and sexuality and trans experience, and but also very interested in like genre fiction and popular media and how all of those things kind of interrelate. I gotta write a new artist statement or something so I can get a better elevator pitch, but that's kind of my deal.
And we had a really amazing, fruitful discussion about the male gaze. And people are really enjoying that episode, which is very cool. I'm glad we're putting that into the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
So as like a follow-up, we thought we would talk about the female gaze. And I kind of had like a pipe dream that we would also talk about the queer gaze. But this got so long that I was like, maybe that's part 3.
Right.
Yeah. And I also felt like I actually don't want to lump the queer gaze in with the female gaze because I actually think it's totally different. When I was rereading my Deviant Eyes, Deviant Bodies by Chris Strayer, I was like, actually, no, this is too different.
Yeah, I think they're going in very different directions as kind of like theoretical frameworks or like modes of rhetoric or something, even though they're responding to some of the same things.
Right. So Sid actually read Iris Bray's book about the female gaze,
Yeah.
which is in French and not translated. So I did not read it. But I want to start off this discussion with Sid telling me about this book. So tell me about Iris Bray's female gaze.
Yeah, so this book came out pretty recently, so it has not yet been translated into English. I suspect, although I do not know this for sure, that it will be soon because it's my understanding that Iris Bray is also working on a sort of documentary or like essay film around some of these same ideas. So were I involved on this team, I would plan it such that the English translation would come out at the same time as the film, although I don't know that for sure. But so it is a book in French called The Female Gaze, A Revolution on Screen, with the caveat that my French is not great. So it was like kind of a painstaking process for me to read this book. And, anyone please listening, feel free to school me if I have misunderstood anything. But essentially, it's Iris Bray making an effort to give what she feels is like a rigorous definition of the female gaze in film, or what female gaze films might look like or mean, because it is a phrase that gets kind of thrown around a lot in sort of contemporary media discourse as a counter to or reaction to or in opposition to the male gaze in film.
I just want to say as an aside that the first time I heard this phrase was the wave of Lady Gaga feminism in like 2009 when everybody was writing essays about Lady Gaga. So it's not like a phrase that Iris Bray, quote unquote, invented. Kind of like how Laura Mulvey didn't invent the phrase the male gaze, like she took it from John Berger. So yeah, that was the first time I heard it.
Yeah, I think the first time I ever encountered it was like in like the handle of an Instagram account or something. So it's a very
tracks.
Yeah, it's a very like.
There was also a lot of exhibitions, like art exhibitions called like the female gaze.
Yeah,
that was very edgy in the early 2010s.
Yeah, it feels like it's been very kind of like buzzword-y and like a phrase that certainly evokes things, but the claim, at least that Iris Bray is making, is that like there hasn't really been a rigorous effort to like define that, and so that people are kind of using the phrase in a variety of different ways. Like sometimes people use it to mean just like a film made by a woman, which Iris Bray rightfully, I think, is like, okay, well, that's not sufficient. Like a woman can definitely make a male gaze film. Like that's not the satisfactory definition. But then also, some people have used it in critical writing to refer to like a woman director objectifying a man in sort of like applying a male gaze kind of thing, but with a gender swap. And sometimes that's what people mean when they say female gaze, which Iris Bray is also like, I don't think that's what we're talking about here. And so this book is in part her attempt to come up with like a rubric for what the female gaze like means in a film. And she talks through a bunch of films that she thinks are examples of that, which we can kind of get into a little bit later. But one of the big like claims, I guess, of this book, or maybe the putting forward of a hypothesis by this book, is that she lists out what she thinks the like 6 qualities of what she would describe as like a female gaze film would be. And maybe I can just like read what they are.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and some of them I think are more effective than others, but we'll talk about it. So she says, on the level of narrative, there are 3 points about narrative, like what is happening in the story, and then 3 points about like what's happening formally with the film. So narratively, she says it's a film where the main character identifies as a woman, the story is told from her point of view, and something about the story is calling into question the patriarchal order of things. And then on the sort of formal choices, and I think based on what she's writing, a lot of that has to do with like camera choices and editing choices. The film is constructed in a manner that allows the spectator to feel the female experience. If bodies are eroticized, it is a conscious gesture, in contrast to Laura Mulvey talking about the kind of unconscious nature of male gaze, or like unconsciousness. And then the last one, which is maybe the one that I take the most issue with, is the pleasure of spectators does not stem from the scopic drive from taking pleasure in objectifying a person through the gaze like a voyeur. That English translation is not mine. That's from a CinemaScope article by Erica Balsam. Otherwise, if I quote from the book, it's my own mediocre translation skills. But those are kind of those points. Identify there's a protagonist who's a woman. It's told from her point of view, and her story questions the patriarchy. And the film is constructed in ways that are designed to make the audience kind of feel what she's experiencing, and the eroticism is conscious and not voyeuristic. And yeah, and again, then she kind of like talks through a variety of specific films. But the other kind of there are a couple moments where she just lays out a definition, so maybe I'll just like give those real quick too, and then we can chat about it. So at the very beginning of the book, so she uses the phrase female gaze like in English a lot in the book.
Okay.
But also
interesting choice.
Yeah, but then also sometimes uses it sort of interchangeably with the French phrase le regard féminin. I can only read it. I can't pronounce anything. But which like French doesn't exactly have the same distinction between like the word that means female and the word that means feminine, like so kind of.
And also the regard would be like to look. It doesn't necessarily mean a gaze.
Right. So it's like a feminine look is literally the like.
Well, I can see why she uses the term female gaze, because gaze is very different than look. Even though Mulvey kind of even uses them somewhat interchangeably, like she talks about the to be looked at-ness of women.
Yeah. So there's this kind of interesting, and also the fact that like le regard is a masculine noun is kind of funny.
Yeah.
And so it's like using the masculine version of the adjective feminine to describe it. So it's like there's already really complicated gender stuff happening just in the grammar of that word, or in that phrase. But so she kind of uses both the French phrase and the English phrase. But so she defines it early in the book as a look that makes us feel the experience of a female body on screen. So by that she means like not necessarily a look created by a female artist, but a look that adopts the point of view of a female character to embrace her experience. And then later she says, a look that gives subjectivity to the female character, thus allowing the viewer, and here she says, literally says, allowing the male viewer and the female viewer to feel the experience of the heroine without identifying with her, which I think is interesting. Or maybe like without necessarily identifying with her. But so it's very much about like, she's very focused in this writing on less of a psychoanalysis model of all this stuff and more of a thinking about embodied experience of the viewer and of the embodied experience of like the image of the body on screen, which is like she describes this as like more of a like a phenomenological approach.
Okay.
And so
academia is so funny.
I know. It's like, okay. And one of the things that she talks about is like that the use of like super close up shots, particularly like of the body and of skin, is something that she talks about in like a lot of the different films that are discussed. And then there's this one other quote I want to read, and that's
Mhm.
kind of all my quotes. um, um, so close-ups not used to carve up a body to objectify it like in porno films, but to give
Mm.
but to give texture to the shot, and above all, share the heroine's desire. By filming skin very close, one can give a haptic quality to the film and no longer an erotic charge. This is the case in Hiroshima Mon Amour by Alan Rene or Go Fish by Rose Troche. From
Oh,
there,
speak for yourself.
yeah, right, exactly. I take issue with it. But it says, so from there, the pleasure of the spectators no longer lies in the perception of a body object, but in the fact that one has the impression of being able to touch these bodies. The female gaze offers another way of desiring, which is no longer based on an asymmetry in power relations, but on the idea of equality and sharing, which I feel like that kind of encapsulates a lot of what she's thinking about. That it is very much about wanting to have like a somewhat like egalitarian relationship between the viewer and the viewed. And I think it feels very telling, or like the fact that for her, in order for the woman to have like a position of agency in this looking, then there has to be like an equal balance of power, which is why, like, again, I feel like this is a not kinky theoretical framework.
No, not at all. And that's kind of why I was like, I think the queer gaze is actually a different thing.
Yeah.
And I also didn't want to be like, well, queer is like women light, like that's
Right,
because
totally.
this is very much like literally about, it's like feminist theory. It's the idea that the men and women should be equal, like that. The desire should be egalitarian. But you also have something here that says that the writing still operates from the assumption that there is a protagonist and that we should identify with or at least empathize with the protagonist.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think like even though, it's saying, oh, to allow the viewer to feel the experience of the heroine without identifying with her as like the requirement to feel empathy. But I think there's still in the writing this attitude that like, okay, for it to be a female gaze film, it's got to be about a woman and that we should feel what she's feeling.
But that's so silly because with the male gaze, a lot of those movies are about women.
Yeah, and I think that the argument, right, is that they're about women, but we're supposed to feel like someone looking at her. We're not supposed to
Okay.
feel what she's feeling.
And in this analysis, it's more like we are supposed to be her, like
Yeah,
be in her position.
right. At least on like a sort of a sensory level or an emotional level,
Right.
even if we don't like intellectually identify with her. But that
Right.
sounds a lot like identifying to me.
I was going to ask, what's the difference?
Right.
Yeah.
And I feel like she is saying that there's a difference that I'm not sure I
But then not
see.
explaining it.
Mhm.
Yeah. You also said here that Bray does acknowledge that the term female gaze might come off as bioessentialist, which is, of course, like very contemporary. Like Laura Mulvey would never have said that back then.
Right.
And that she emphasizes that trans women are women and that feminine and female is not the opposite of masculine and male.
Yeah.
But still has a certain type of cis woman's attachment to a kind of historical feminist language of womanness. That's a quote from you.
Yeah, like I think she has a moment kind of early on where she's like, so the phrase female gaze, like, and emphasizing the kind of femaleness of it, and we're talking about women, and like, and she kind of talks about like, oh, well, like in my circles, like there's all kinds of gender stuff happening, and like I know that this is not like that it's not like a binary or whatever, but like I still think that the position of women is like so central to this discussion that like using this language still feels like the right language to me. And it's like it's not a super like satisfying answer to that counter argument, but like she at least like knows that counter argument is like coming. And
Right. It's not super convincing, but at least she acknowledges
And
it.
and does make a point to like at various points in the book make direct reference to the fact that when she's talking about women in film, she is including trans women in that.
But then doesn't really mention any movies with trans women.
Right. And so like it feels a little
I'm doing my due diligence, but like I don't really care.
yeah,
Or
or like I'm like it feels like a very like cis woman perspective on it. Like, oh, like I'm acknowledging this. So that's check. Like that's done. Like again, like a lot of people don't clear that very low bar. So it's good that she does. But it feels like not necessarily a like a deep enough reckoning with that. And like when she talks about it not being this kind of opposite, like not kind of like binary thing, she has a very kind of abstract way of talking about that, like talks about Derrida.
okay, tell me.
Let me find the section. Yeah, that it's like it's not like they're opposites, but that they're different in the sort of sense of différence. And I'm like,
Oh, French people.
right, and I'm like, I am not totally sure I've read enough theory to like get where you're going with this point. Because it's like this like very abstract argument. So I'm scrolling through the ebook. But I think like again that it's not about like, and I do think it's correct, right? That to not be like, oh, feminine looking is not just the opposite of male looking. But it's like it's a more complicated and sort of destabilizing relationship. Like, oh, the female gaze is the thing that destabilizes the concept of the male gaze or the structure of the male gaze. It's not its
Okay, that makes sense.
yeah. And I think like trying to yeah, I mean, to escape phallocentric discourse is, I believe, the phrase used. And like I think that that's accurate to a sense, right? Or like that's like a way of thinking about female gaze in relation to male gaze that is more open and more interesting than just like, and then there's chicks making movies too. Wowza.
Well, that's a lot of female gaze writing, or I was looking up some other, like, what are some other female gaze texts? Hold on. And some of the texts that have been mentioned a lot are this essay from The Handmaid's Tale to I Love Dick. The female gaze is thriving on television. Then there was like a rebuttal to that essay. But a lot of this is like very heterosexual.
I think it feels like it's all very television oriented.
Yes.
Which
yes.
she does talk a fair amount about television in this book. I'm less equipped to talk about it because I haven't seen any of the shows.
I really don't know. I don't feel like I don't really watch that much like episodic media. And then when I do, it's like to zone out. Like right. I'm not really analyzing it very deeply. But there was another article called No Such Thing Yet, Questioning Television Female Gaze. And then there was another one called Chick Flicks and the Straight Female Gaze by Natalie Perfetti Oates. And that the heterosexual female gaze can become problematic because it objectifies the male subject. So then there's also these like little offshoots of female gaze, like there's the heterosexual female gaze,
which is just like gender swap male gaze, it sounds like.
Yes, which is like who cares? And
like, whatever, objectify more men, I guess.
Yeah,
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And then something by Jessica Taylor, which I believe is like a longer piece called Romance and the Female Gaze, Obscuring Gendered Violence in the Twilight Saga.
Oh, well,
So
I have recorded many hours of podcast about Twilight, so I perhaps should not get into it on this one.
yeah, Sid has a podcast called American Vampire, right?
Yeah.
Which is about the Twilight series. So if you want to hear more about that,
Right. Yeah.
check. I mean, I feel like I just watched them for the first time ever, and it's not so much a female gaze as it is a Mormon gaze.
I would absolutely agree.
Yeah.
I feel like the Mormonness of those texts is more important than their being written by a woman-ness.
I like the idea of there being all these like different gazes, and like female and male are just two of them.
Right?
Like
It's like
that
we're at the optometrist, and it's like the thing at the optometrist where they put all the different lenses in front of your eye.
Yeah. Yeah, like they're existing because we've been so brainwashed into a gender binary, like we sort of feel like those are just the two, or that they exist as opposites from each other. But I think that like you can apply multiple gazes to different films, like Je tu il elle, which Iris Bray talks about, is like a female gaze according to her definition, but it's also a queer gaze.
Absolutely.
Right. So, and I feel like films can even contain the male and the female gaze, like at different points in the narrative. And that I can get behind.
Yeah, I mean, I think like having this like little rubric, I think like yes, it's helpful to have a definition for a term if you're going to use it, especially something so potentially like nebulous and just like evocative without detail, as the phrase female gaze. But on the other hand, I'm like, I feel like reducing everything to being a sort of Bechdel test reiteration is also not a very fun way to watch a film.
Yeah, it's just not fun. And that's what we were talking about last time. We were like, so where's the pleasure? Because this essay has a sexy title, but this isn't a very sexy essay.
Yeah. And I think like there are parts of this book that like are describing things pretty sexily, but it's like always in a context of like egalitarian sexiness, that it feels like really pointedly that like the way that she writes about the piano, for example, is like it's like pretty sexy, at least like parts of it, the parts that are not about the horrible things that happen in that film. But and like when she's talking about Portrait of a Lady on Fire, right, it's like it's very like ooh, but it's kind of dependent on, I think, the equal playing field that is present at least in those moments of that film. Like it seems that there is room in Iris Bray's discourse, right, for like things to be sexy, but they also have to be like fair.
And that's not very sexy. But also I'm a perv, so.
Right, or like that can be sexy, right? Like, but it is not it doesn't encompass that wide a range of the human experience of interpersonal relationships, right? Like there's almost always some kind of power differential at play. And that's like part of what's fun.
That's like also part of being human.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know if things can ever truly be completely egalitarian in sex.
Right, or like and like stay there,
right, and stay there, right? Like it could move in and out of that, right? But to be fixed at that, just like I don't think a film is fixed in one gaze or another. So let's talk about we've started talking about some of Iris Bray's selected female gaze films and
Yeah,
series.
so at the end of the book, there is a sort of almost like a syllabus or a watching list or something of films and television series that she thinks that if you're interested in this, you should take a look at.
That she
And there are
feels
a lot.
illustrate the female gaze as she defines it.
And I, it, there's some really interesting choices on here. Especially when I got to this list at the end, there were a couple of things that I was surprised to see on this list after the way that she talked about them in the text itself. I think most notably, Anatomy of Hell, because she talks about Catherine Breillat in a way that she basically says when she's talking about like there's the female gaze and the male gaze, and then she is basically like, in Catherine Breillat films, it gets like really complicated. It's complex. I don't know how to feel about it.
Anatomy of Hell. I mean, Catherine Breillat is one of my all-time favorite filmmakers. And I remember in college, I was talking to like a group of like feminists, like who were into film. We were all hanging out, and I was like, I really loved Anatomy of Hell. I watched it recently, and this one like cis straight woman was like, "How can you like that movie?" Like, her entire thesis is that women are disgusting. Like, how could you like that? And I was like, okay. But people have that's just very indicative of people have very strong reactions to her work. And Anatomy of Hell in particular. So the plot of Anatomy of Hell, for people who haven't seen it, is there's this gay man played by Rocco Siffredi, porn star Rocco Siffredi, who
He's super hot.
he's really hot and also really hot as a gay man, like specifically. Also like BDE for this straight male porn star playing a gay man, not giving a fuck. He's in Romance as well, another one of her movies, which I think actually illustrates Iris Bray's thesis more. So
I wonder if it's harder to find or something, because I haven't seen that one yet.
Okay.
But I really, really want to.
It's great.
So I'm excited to talk to you about it once I see it.
Yeah, it's great. And in Anatomy of Hell, basically, Rocco Siffredi is in a gay club, and there's this lone woman standing in the corner kind of watching him, and he goes, as he's going down to the bathroom in the basement, she's coming up, and as she's coming up, she like brushes him very like sexually. And being intrigued, he goes back down to the bathroom to find her, and she is in the bathroom cutting herself, like in the act of, he thinks, trying to kill herself. And he's like, "Why are you doing that?" And she's like, "Because I'm a woman." So it's very French.
Oh yeah, it is one of the most French movies I've ever seen.
Yeah. And she ends up hiring him to come to her house every night for a week and watch her, like in her bedroom naked. And that's basically the plot. It's very audacious. Not a lot of people go there. Not a lot of directors can go there and really talk about the misogyny of gay men. That's very rare. I can't really think of any other films that really explore that this way.
Right, like that aggressively, like really get into it.
Yeah. And for that alone, it's an important film. And basically they have a lot of, French style dialogues about gender, and about the inherent like revulsion that people have for the female body, specifically the cis female body. And he kind of like very childishly explores her body. They have sex. It's also like very unclear if the sex is like rape, that this might, sound counterintuitive, but it makes more sense in the plot. Like rape that she's like kind of allowing to happen.
Yeah, the like who has power in what ways and who is consenting under what kind of coercion in like every interaction they have is incredibly complicated.
Yes.
And like and it seems like not only can we as viewers not clearly parse that out, but I don't think the characters know either.
They don't know. Yeah. So the film offers no answers. It's just sort of exploring that question. And it's just like really amazing for showing a sexual relationship between a gay man and a cis woman. And he's very like repulsed but also very fascinated by her body. This movie was very famous because it has like close-up pussy shots, like of a a dildo like coming out of a pussy. There's menstrual blood, which a lot of films are shy away from. Rocco Siffredi like puts his hand inside of her and takes it out, and it's covered in blood, and he puts it in his mouth. Yeah, it's great. It's a great movie. But this young woman was so upset with me for liking this movie. So I was just remembering that on this rewatch. But what does Iris Bray say about it?
So one of the things she says about both Anatomy in Hell and Fat Girl, or À ma sœur, to my sister, which is another film by Catherine Breillat, says that it like leaves you with like a confused feeling. She says like you don't know what, like you really don't know what to say or like what to think or what you're what you're really looking at or how. That it like she's like it complicates the categories of male gaze and female gaze.
Yes, that's kind of the point.
Right. And like part of why she considers it a female gaze film is that like in the film the woman is asking the man to look at her where she's like not look at a bowl, if that makes sense. Right? Like that's like what if we're thinking about the kind of to be looked at-ness that we talked about in the context of the male gaze episode, like that what Anatomy of Hell is partially about is when do women not have a to be looked at-ness, and what does it mean to make a man look at her when she's does not have the to be looked at-ness.
I like that analysis.
Yeah. And I think it's like I think too, like one of the things that I'm laughing just because it's funny in French to see the word porno for some reason.
Porno. Like I just love like Europeans saying porno.
Yeah. But so like part of it is thinking about like how it's shot, and that the close-ups don't necessarily like reduce Rocco Siffredi to his, this is her language, reduce him to his status as a porno actor.
Yeah, but the fact that he's a porno actor, is kind of the point. It's
right.
Which
is why I feel like she doesn't quite get it.
She doesn't get it. Yeah, he's a famous porn star. There's no, using him in a film is a very deliberate choice. He is known for that. It's not that Catherine Breillat was like, well, I need people who are okay like showing dick on camera, so I'll get a porn star, which is kind of what Iris Bray, that's kind of like what sounds like she's...
Feels like the vibe of that sentence, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And no, it's because he's a famous heterosexual porn star who is famous, not just a famous porn star, but famous for violent heterosexual pornography. And,
right, exactly.
Yeah, and he is in a role as a gay man and he doesn't have sexy sex scenes. Like,
Right. It's like he's having a very clearly weird and complicated time while
exactly.
he's having
Like
sex with her.
there's one part where they have sex, or he has sex with her while she's sleeping. The consent is dubious. And afterwards he orgasms and he sobs. And she comforts him. And it's just not, the point is the confusion, and it's also playing with your expectations of this man and pointing to his real life status. Like, that is very much part of the role.
Right, because he's like one of the most famous like adult film actors of porno.
Yeah, he is. Yeah,
in like all of Europe.
Exactly. Yeah, and
also he speaks French with an Italian accent
it's
in
hot.
this film.
Yeah,
it's really charming.
Yeah, I really like Rocco Siffredi. But yeah, he's famous for like like I said, not just heterosexual porn, but like specifically like violent, that has been highly criticized. So that feels like it's missing the point a little bit.
Yeah, and I think similarly, like, so Âme Sœur, or Fat Girl, is like not on this list, but it is talked about like briefly in the text.
That fascinates me.
And is like, because so like, which the sentence she says is like that Catherine Breillat is like making the male gaze like more like, is like evoking it kind of intentionally, but then that's like to like recreate the kind of triangulation of gazes by like when one sister is looking at the other sister with this man, that like where that like kind of where we're placed in that becomes also like unsettled or not like clearly defined in terms of like, oh, this is how we're supposed to place ourselves in a gaze, because we're like looking at this younger sister looking at her older sister in this like sexualized situation, and that like that confusion is part of what's like the film is about, but it seems like for Iris Bray, that's like not enough to get it on the list.
That seems silly to me, but yeah, I mean, it's the other thing I wanted to say about Anatomy of Hell also is because we're talking about protagonists, and that seems very important to Iris Bray. Both of those characters are the protagonists, and I would actually argue that Rocco Siffredi is the protagonist and not the woman that he watches, because we are in his POV the entire time. When he leaves her house and goes to a bar, and he has this conversation with this drunk old man who's like going on a tangent about like a misogynist tangent basically, and Rocco Siffredi like joins in, kind of like cosplaying a straight man, and but now he like has things to say because he just experienced this. We're with him, we're not with her. So and she's mysterious. We don't know anything about her. We know a lot more about him. He's gay. He lives in the city. He's a hustler. He hates women. He frequents nightclubs and gets blowjobs on the dance floor. We know a lot more about him than we know about her. So
yeah,
I would argue that he's the protagonist.
Right. And if like we're going this very like narrative normative way of looking at a film, like if anybody is going through like a change, right,
it's
like,
him.
Yeah, because like we don't really know where she's at.
She's very mysterious. She's more of like a specter of his disgust than she is a real person. Like, so it's kind of also an irony too, because she invites him in to view her as like a real person, but Catherine Breillat very intentionally obscures everything about her. So, I mean, like we know some things, you know, like she lives in this very isolated area in this weird house. Um, she is obviously not doing well mentally, and she talks a little bit about her early experiences as a young girl being looked at. But overall, she's mysterious in the film because she is mysterious to him. So I would argue that we're more with him in the movie than we are with her.
Yeah, I think you're totally right about that.
And then in Fat Girl, which in French it's fuck your sister, right?
It's like at my sister, like to my sister. So it's like unclear to me what the tone of that is supposed to be as a title.
So this is another movie that has been very controversial in my life. I'll just tell a story because I feel like it's relevant. When I was in college, first reading about the male gaze, I was in my first film class ever, and this is what completely turned me off of film, and I actually like switched to doing something else, and then came back to film later in grad school. But we watched Fat Girl, so I took a class about French film, like history of French film, and we watched Fat Girl. And for those who don't know, Fat Girl is about two sisters, one older and thin and conventionally beautiful, and the other is younger and fat. And they go with their parents on a holiday, and the older sister meets an older man and has a sexual relationship with him that is very like manipulative and messed up. But she like falls head over heels for him. And the fat sister is kind of like a witness to all of it. So that's the kind of the general plot. And there is a scene where the older sister is coerced into having anal sex because she doesn't want to lose her virginity. And during that scene, the young men in my class, you know, at the time I didn't think of them that way, but we were all 18, were laughing during that scene.
Wow.
Yeah. And a couple of the women left the room because they were so offended. And being a scrappy baby feminist, I stayed, and I was the only woman left. And after the film ended, I asked why they were laughing. One guy was like, well, that's like, it was so exaggerated and silly. Like, that doesn't happen. And I was like, it does.
Yeah, I definitely had an interaction almost
exactly
verbatim,
like that.
almost verbatim like
yeah,
that.
to the point where
like,
the film
yeah.
is more about it's so generic that it's something that so many women can relate to, and or people who grew up like as women, or you know, people seeing them as women. It's yeah, and I by the way, I include trans women in that definition. I think a lot of people think people are just talking about AFAB people, but I think trans women are included in that. I think people see the feminine in closeted young trans women and take advantage of it.
Yeah, like when people say that, like when people try to make the claim that trans women are socialized as men, it's like, no, they're generally they're very specifically socialized as closeted trans women, which is like a totally different set of
yeah,
experiences.
and
like,
you know, and it's perhaps that trans people who are AFAB identify with that experience, the experience of girlhood as well, because it's such an abject position that you know, so many of us fall into, and I include trans women in that.
Yeah, and I would say, like, for myself too, like, I definitely, like, while like I would describe myself as like a non-binary trans person and not a woman, but like I had a like I had experiences that I would describe as a girlhood, and I feel like that film really like incredibly accurately portrays elements of that in a way that I had like never
It's very
experienced in
moving
a film
because
before.
it's, I mean, when I saw it very shortly after something like that had happened to me when I was in high school, and it helped me conceptualize it as wrong. And, you know, not that I even think that that's what the movie is trying to do, but it's because I think Catherine Breillat doesn't like to give straight answers. But just seeing that experience on screen was so powerful for me. And, you know, when these young men were like, that doesn't happen, I was like, we are having a completely different experience of the world, because it sure does. And it happened to probably all of the women in this room that left. And it was just a very strange first week of film school.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it too, especially like those dudes in that film class were probably about the age of
because like, I think he's
that
supposed to be
man in
on
the film
break.
Yeah, like
from
19,
college,
20.
or like, and it's like,
He
yeah,
is, and she's like
those guys who are
15.
laughing at
Yeah.
it, like statistically, the likelihood that like they're behaving that way is probably not in their favor. Like,
Exactly. Yeah. And we had what I thought was a good discussion where they like kind of, you know, they made, well, the professor needed to intervene, but that's a whole other thing. But I ended up getting harassed by one of the guys for a long
Wow.
time. He was putting notes in my mailbox. So that, and then he had to leave our school because he apparently made a film that was so misogynist
Wow.
that none of the professors wanted to work with him. Yeah. So, Catherine Breillat inspires very strong reactions. My grad school professor, having more interactions with this particular film, my grad school professor was the critic Amy Taubin, and who's actually mentioned a lot in the scholarship that I read for this podcast, so that's very funny. And she's a big Catherine Breillat fan, and I had written an essay, and Amy Taubin was the kind of professor that she would hand your papers back to you in front of everyone and talk about how you did in front of everyone. And she handed back this one girl's paper to her, and she goes, well, this paper was written at a 5th grade level. I know. And she gave me back my paper, and she was like, you can do better than this. Like, you're going to redo this. So I chose, so she was giving a little bit more benefit to me. And I chose to write about Fat Girl. But yeah, anyway, I just wanted to tell that story because it's just such such polarizing work.
I'm not going to say anything about the contents of the ending because I think people should watch it and form their own opinions about it. But it's like, I feel like it's very much a film that I could see people having like one opinion about like 90% of it, and then a completely different opinion about the very end, which I think is like a bold choice and like kind of interesting formally. That like I feel like it's a film that could have ended like a little bit earlier and been so much less controversial. And she was like, fuck that. I'm making this film. Like, and this is where it's going.
I love her. Yeah, and massive spoiler alert, and I usually don't really care about spoilers, but I will say that if you want to watch Fat Girl, like, it is nice to go in fresh and not know this, but just because I want to talk about the ending, spoiler. So at the end of Fat Girl, the 3 women in the family, the mother, the older sister, and the younger daughter, are driving away, and there's been a lot of, controversy over the older daughter like fucking this grown man, And they're driving away and they get tired, so they pull off on the side of the road
Yeah,
to
at
go to
like a
sleep, which you
truck
should
stop
never do.
or something.
And they, yeah, yeah, don't do that if you're a woman. And this man breaks through the windshield and murders
Yeah.
the mother and daughter. It's like very sudden, like out of nowhere. And he breaks through the windshield and murders the mother and daughter, and the fat daughter runs into the woods and he captures her and rapes her. And as he is raping her, she exerts a lot of agency. And she's like, make it quick. Like, she's kind of like playing at it like it's sex, like it's like consensual sex. She's like having this virginity loss moment. And then when the police come, she denies
They ask
that
her
happened,
if
kind of.
they're like, yeah, she says he didn't rape her, and she's like, well, don't believe me if you don't want to like these cops. And it also
Yeah.
like it feels like part of the foreshadowing of that is like while she's having a conversation with her sister earlier on, she talks about how like that she wants to lose her virginity to someone that she doesn't care about, like that it doesn't matter, because she's seen how like emotionally devastating it is.
Well, she doesn't want to be like her sister. She's like, you're an idiot. The whole time she's like the silent observer, and she is kind of like thinks her sister is stupid for believing this man, and taking she sees the suffering
Like,
that she goes through, and she's like,
won't
I'm not gonna go through that.
allow myself to be like emotionally impacted by a man in that way. And then this like incredibly extreme,
Yeah.
like what is like the furthest you could take that logic in a scenario is what happens.
Yeah, it's like both what is the furthest you can take that logic,
Right.
and also what is the difference between this and what we saw earlier. Like, kind of, which one is worse, really? Which one who are these kind of men? Or, it's just very, like, there's no answers, like, as in all of her work. Anyway, I obviously love her work and could talk about it forever.
No. Yeah, she doesn't
But
dedicate
Iris Bray
that
doesn't
much
seem like a fan.
time
Yeah.
to talking about those two films. But they were the ones that I watched as a result of reading this book that I was the most excited to talk to you about. So I'm glad that we spent so much time on them.
Yeah. It's interesting. I would be interested to hear what you think of Romance, and it's also really interesting that she didn't include it, because that is like the Catherine Breillat female gaze movie.
Yeah, I will definitely check that out. I'm
more
excited
than
to.
these. Yeah. And then she also talks about Le Passion de Jeanne d'Arc, which is like, I'm going way back in time, but that's from 1928. That's directed by a man.
Yeah, there
Carl
are
Theodor
a few
Dreyer.
films on this list directed by men. So The Passion, and then
Thelma and
Todd
Louise.
Haynes is Carol, and Paul Verhoeven's Elle, which she actually talks about at like pretty substantial length, and seems to like be pretty into in a way that I was like pleasantly surprised by.
I love Elle. What does she say about it?
Yeah, so I think like part of what she likes about it is the fact that we aren't necessarily like, so the way she's talking about it particularly is about like depictions of assault in film. And I think part of what is interesting to her is like how the assaults that take place in Elle are shot, that like where like and sort of how the camera moves and where it's placed, she feels like it's not like the kind of typical male gaze way of filming assault in film. In part, like there are moments where the camera kind of has the point of view of her cat, rather than like we aren't expected as the audience to kind of like place ourselves with this man, and we're not looking at her really. Like we're kind of like where the camera is not always like giving us the kind of like ideal view where we can like see everything happening.
So it's
Because
not an exploitation film.
right.
I mean, that's like, I guess like one of the other gripes I have with this kind of theory is like when people are like, well, the body is not on display. And I'm like, well, when is the female body on display in a rape scene except in a Grindhouse movie?
Right.
Yeah. Like which, you know, obviously there's a lot of reasons for that, but there's movies like The Accused, which are obviously not, it's not on this list, but that assault is much more from the perspective of like, what if you were a bystander? But it's certainly not like objectifying. But that, yeah, anyway, I feel like I interrupted you.
Yeah, well, and like part of it too is like about like how the way that like that relation I'm trying to think how to like succinctly describe this. But basically the fact that the way that her relationship with this man kind of like is shifting in its power dynamics is like this like the way that who she kind of like how she is placed in a power relationship to him doesn't follow this very like linear path. I think part of what's so like surprising and interesting about that film, right, is that it doesn't take the trajectory that you think it's going to. And that like the way that she looks at things, the way that she looks at this man, but also the way that she looks at images of herself and like talks about images of herself, is a thing that like evolves over the course of the film. Like because she talks at length about like a picture of herself as a child and how distant she is from it. And so like part of the trajectory of the film is like her becoming more embodied through trauma. Kind of like rather than becoming like more disembodied or more like detached from herself.
Or more embodied, not even through trauma, but I mean, I guess like it is trauma, you know, just like inherently, but more embodied through by going through an experience that put her in her body. That's kind of how I was more thinking of it, like having to be aware of the body in that way.
Yeah, because like I think,
or like and also like reminds her of her femaleness.
Yeah, and I think like that because like also the fact that the way that film talks about like friendship between women is also like feels related to that in a way that I don't have an articulate thought about yet.
I don't have an articulate thought either, but yeah, I'm also just thinking about like Paul Verhoeven's oeuvre.
Yeah, I did watch Benedetta earlier
What'd you
today
think?
because I hadn't seen it yet, and I was like, oh, maybe anyone want to talk about it. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like, hell yeah, horny nun movie. This is great.
Well, what I really, you know, Paul Verhoeven, like Basic Instinct, like I can buy that movie as a movie that illustrates the male gaze for sure. And then I can buy Elle as a movie that illustrates the female gaze. I just think like he's very obviously a very controversial director, just like Catherine Breillat. And I would be interesting to hear what Iris Bray would say about his early work, because movies like Elle and Benedetta are much more quote unquote feminist. Whereas I mean, he thought he was making feminist work, but like,
I think think that's probably true.
Yeah. And with something like Showgirls, I would be interested to hear what she would say about something like that. Elle is considered like his like more the movie that's like considered his like high art film.
Yeah, and she does like talk about the fact that a bunch of, it was sort of denounced by feminists. Like, and she thinks
Elle
that
was? Because I'm
yeah.
sure it was in France, that was probably more of a discussion than it was here.
Right. Like, I don't remember there being any discourse about that movie here when it came
Americans
out.
don't watch foreign films.
Right, yeah. Like, I don't remember any of that. But I think in like French film schools, I'm sure there was a lot of drama about it. And, she was like, I think, she says that is like a reductionist, like a reductive way of thinking about the film is like just about like that it's like participating in rape culture while denouncing it, which is like, well, it's once again the thing of like, well, if we want to make a film about something,
It's
it
got to
is
be
hard.
about that.
Yeah, like it's hard for that thing to not be in the film.
Yeah, and also
It's a
I've talked about this before on this podcast probably, but I don't like the idea that rape is so horrific and forbidden and mysterious that we can't show it in a movie. Like I feel like that's just more alienating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like one of the things that film can do is to help us to understand the nuance of complicated experiences by seeing experiences that are similar to but different from our own and how various characters react to them. And I think that, one of the things that film is helpful to me in, I think, is like in understanding like my own experiences of abuse and things like that and what it might look like to continue to live my life in whatever way.
Well, something I also really like about Elle is Isabelle Huppert. After she gets assaulted in her own home, she doesn't really tell anyone. And then when she does, she's like, yeah, I was like raped yesterday. Like
She's like at dinner really casually.
Yeah, which I love that element of the movie because rape is treated culturally like the worst thing that can ever happen to a woman. And it's simultaneously like, we're not supposed to talk about it, but also you're supposed to have the correct reaction. And the correct reaction is to be a ruined woman or a strong survivor. And she's just her in this.
She's just like film. Kind of a bitch.
She's like, just kind of a bitch. Yeah.
And that's like part of what I love about that character.
Exactly. And she's just like, yeah, I was raped yesterday. Like, it's just, it's not, she is like, doesn't want this to be the focal point of her life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that like, that the idea that something could never be present in a film, or if so, it has to only be treated with like the absolute utmost seriousness, and the stakes have to be so high if this subject is ever to be reckoned with in a film. I think that attitude is also part of what we kind of subsume into ourselves, right? And so it's like, okay, so then I am supposed to only think about the traumas that I've experienced with like the intense immensity of weight of them, and I have to be, in this like participating in this like grand narrative about the awful things that befell me. But like that's not actually how everyone best for themselves like reckons with those things and like deals with those things. Like, as someone who likes to make like really dark jokes about the fucked up things that have happened to me, and like that's also useful, right? Like that's like also therapeutic. Or like, what does it mean to like have a traumatic experience and like make a fetish out of it? That might make me feel better, actually.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
And that's completely fine. The human brain is very weird. And we don't fully understand all of the things that happen up there and how things connect. And I just like that this movie is a different way of looking at this. There's some of the other films she mentions, speaking of rape on film, Base Moi from 2000. Have you seen that?
I have not, but I would love to hear about it from you.
Oh, it's great. I actually screened it last year. The book was originally written by French feminist Virginie Despentes, and the movie is directed by Coralie Trinty and Virginie Despentes. And it was a very controversial film. Theaters were raided while the movie was playing. Like the cops came in and like stopped the film. So it's about these two women. So one is named Manu, and she is living in the like Muslim section of France. So there's also a lot of class and race commentary in the film. Manu has lived a difficult life, abused and violently raped. She sets off to find herself, only to meet Nadine, a prostitute who has encountered one too many injustices in the world. Angry at the world, they embark on a twisted, rage-filled road trip. They choose to have sex when they please and kill when they need, leaving a trail of mischief and dead bodies in their wake. Generating a media blitz and manhunt, soon everyone is out to capture the young fugitives.
Yeah, that sounds really fun.
It's great. It's one of my favorite movies. It stars Karen Lancome and Raphael Anderson, who were both adult film actresses, and both of North African descent. Coralie met them, one of the writers, who I believe is also of North African descent, met them while she was herself working in the adult film industry. So it's a film made by sex workers, about sex workers.
That's awesome.
It's very awesome. It's based on the novel by Despentes, which there are quite a few differences between the film and the book. The book dives much deeper, and I also recommend it. The novel garnered a lot of criticism and media buzz as well. Its debut cemented Despentes as part of the new wave of feminist French punk writers of the 1990s. And there was similar feminist writing going on globally at the time. Like in the US, we had Riot Girl and writers like Michelle T. But the French version of it is cooler. The film received a lot of intense media coverage because of its graphic mix of violence and explicit sex. It's often considered an example of new French extremity. The title has a double meaning, because the French noun "un baiser" means a kiss, but as a verb it means to fuck. So it simply
one of those things that's challenging for new French speakers.
Right. It's the title simply means "fuck me," but in some markets has been screened as "rape me." In 2002 interview, the interpretation of "rape me" was rejected by the directors. So that seems like a very American interpretation. It's often characterized as being within the rape revenge genre, but whereas rape revenge is, as a genre, is traditionally kind of about women's rage directed at the patriarchy and at men specifically, this film is more about class rage, and specifically the way that women of the lower class are disenfranchised. Because the women, they also kill women in the film, and that represent like the upper class to them. Many people found this a very disturbing inversion of the rape revenge trope. But the film is really about the way class is gendered and the violent experiences of being an impoverished woman. And like I said, it was like really pilloried by the far right movement in France, by pro-family groups. The state council offered a rating of 18 plus, which had been abolished in 1990, meaning that Base Moi received the much more maligned rating of X, which meant that the film could only be shown in specially licensed outlets and receive no financial support from the government, rendering it impossible to recoup the costs. So it's a punishment rating.
Totally.
kind of like here, except the government doesn't help us make movies here. And then Despont and Trinity, campaigned against the X rating, which became like a national debate, with the far right decrying the film's anti-establishment directed violence and sexuality. Intellectual and artistic communities lobbied for freedom of expression and the cultural merits of the film. Supporters included Catherine Breillat, Claire, of course, Claire Denis, of course.
Who Claire Denis is like notably absent from this list.
She must have an issue with her because she's another big French feminist director.
Too many men in her films, I think, is the unfortunately simple answer to that. It's like her protagonists are all dudes.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, and her movies rule.
Yeah, her movies are so good.
Trouble Every Day is a wonderful movie. I showed that in this like lineup when I showed Base-Moi. Godard, Jean-Luc Godard was another person who defended the film. Righteous. And there was like a public demonstration. So under pressure, the French Minister of Culture reinstated the 18+ rating, which allowed the film to be legally released again in theaters.
Wow.
Yeah. So I would.
Yeah, I'm excited to watch it.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked it up before, and people have been like, "It's not as violent as I thought it would be," but it's a difficult movie. Just a side note, I can probably get you a copy of it. It's hard to find. So
yeah, I would love to see it because she talks in the book a bit about how it's edited and how it's shot and how the intercutting of shots that might have a kind of like pornographic look to them, but then like the way that they're intercut with other things like takes that and makes it like a subjective pornographic look or something. But I obviously couldn't get as much out of reading about it without having seen it. So
right. Yeah. I would, according to her standards, like some of her standards I think are really subjective, that you illustrated to me. Obviously I haven't read the book, but if the female gaze, there needs to be a female protagonist and we empathize with them, that is certainly Base-Moi. I think other people might watch it and really not empathize with them. It was a whole debate about it. So that's, it also depends where the viewer is coming from.
Yeah. And like, what does it mean to like feel like you're feeling what they're feeling?
Right.
And is that what empathy is? Or is that what people mean when they say empathy?
I also just like don't really care about empathy that much, but that's another time.
I mean, I think it's not the only way to relate to a film. And I think, like, again, this very character-oriented way of thinking about a film is one of the limitations, I think, of this way, this sort of theoretical framing continuing from Mulvey.
Right. Yeah.
And I think maybe one thing that we could talk about briefly is she spends a fair amount of time in the book talking about Wonder Woman, the 2017 movie.
Please tell me about what her take about Wonder Woman.
And like she describes her experience of seeing it in the theater and like how like incredibly moved she was.
Oh God.
Like what a like amazing experience it was to see like all of these women like training together, seeming invincible, and I was just like, oh my God.
That's
but, like,
so heterosexual.
Yeah, and also like the fact that I think this very character oriented way of thinking about the like gender politics of a film or the politics of a film, right, is like how you can end up with things like thinking that a movie like Wonder Woman is like extremely progressive, whereas like it's like okay, yes, we can have lady superheroes too. We can have women participating in the military industrial complex and its propaganda. This also, like, congratulations, we have more female guards now.
That movie is the military gaze, not the female
Yeah,
gaze. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I had like an okay time watching that movie. I saw it in theaters with my middle-aged mother,
I
who
saw it in
was
theaters
like,
with my ex-girlfriend.
yeah, my mom was like, "Wow, look at like look at all those broads up there fighting. I'm good for them, you know?" Um and so like I had a nice time, I guess, while it was happening, and then I was like, "Oh, I feel like I just like watched a recruitment video, you know?"
That's how I feel whenever I watch a superhero movie.
Yeah. Like, am I gonna watch the new Batman because I'm horny for Robert Pattinson? Yeah, but am I gonna be happy about myself doing that? No.
I'm going to
But
watch it because I'm horny for Zoe Kravitz, and also I want to laugh. So
right.
I
But like,
like to laugh.
yeah, like I mean, it's like I think it's, again, like, okay, yeah, that movie, I understand why someone could have fun watching Wonder Woman, but it's to think about it as like deeply progressive just because it's showing a woman being strong, and like the camera choices are about her strength, not necessarily about her fuckability. Although I would say, yeah, on that assessment, but
I
like
disagree.
of
Yeah,
like how it's shot.
yeah.
Um, but and it was like directed by a woman. This is directed by Patty Jenkins, but it's like, again, I think this way of thinking about it is a way that is a way of thinking about a film's politics that like stops at like
Girl power.
yeah, like at the level of like this character, and do I feel what this character is feeling, and do I care about this character, and like do I feel myself reflected in this character, and not like how does this fit into like global militarization politics or whatever.
Yeah, how about the fact that it uses feminism and the mainstream appeal, contemporary appeal of feminism to advance a militarized agenda? Like, that's really what's going on in that movie. It's like, yeah, I mean, also, she doesn't look particularly strong. She looks like she weighs 90 pounds soaking wet. Like, if you
Right.
really want to give me a strong Wonder Woman, give me a muscle queen. Like, give me someone with bulk. There were some women in that movie on the Sapphic Island that they lived on that were very muscular, and they're not the main characters, and there's a reason for that, which plays much into like a patriarchal framework of how women are supposed to look. She's very much still supposed to be very attractive and pretty and palatable. So yeah, that's embarrassing, like you said in your
Yeah.
notes.
Yeah, that was like the one film that I was like, okay, yeah, I don't agree with this at all.
Toutes portes ouvertes en plein courant d'air. Je suis une maison vide, sans toi, sans toi, comme une île déserte que recouvre la mer. Mes plages se dévident sans toi, sans toi. Belle en pure perte, nue au cœur de l'hiver, je suis un corps avide, sans toi, sans toi, rongé par le cafard, morte au cercueil de verre, je me couvre de rides, sans toi, sans toi. toi, sans toi.